Hi everyone, and welcome to this GCSE History revision tutorial. Today we're going to revise the early years of the Weimar Republic. So let's start by looking at the big picture of the Weimar Republic from the year it was created in 1919 up to 1929. That's just before the Great Depression hit Germany. It really helps if we divide this period into two phases. First of all, the early phase between 1919 and 1923, when the Weimar Republic was very fragile. In this period, it faced huge economic and political problems. And then the later phase between 1924 to 1929, and we call this the Golden Age of Weimar. This is when the Weimar Republic starts to recover, largely due to the policies of Stresemann. In this tutorial, we're going to focus on the early challenges. So let's look back at how the Weimar Republic was set up. And to understand that, we really need to go back to Germany's experience in World War I. The war had a devastating effect on Germany. 2 million German soldiers died in the trenches, and it also had an economic impact as well, as the Kaiser's government fell deeper and deeper into debt, paying for the war effort. The British Navy also blockaded Germany's seaports, and this caused starvation and disease to break out in Germany. Now, this suffering led to a political collapse inside Germany. There were widespread strikes and riots by 1917, and some units of the German Navy actually mutinied or turned against their officers in October of 1918. Workers across the country began to set up their own councils, and it seemed very likely that there would be some form of communist revolution, as had happened in Russia the previous year. This political collapse led to the creation of the Weimar Republic, and here's how. German army leaders, fearful of communism and revolution, decided to push the Kaiser to abdicate his throne. The army leaders then worked with socialist politicians, including this man, Ebert of the Social Democrats, and they worked together to avoid a communist takeover. The first thing the Social Democrats did was to send a representative, Matthias Erzberger, to sign an armistice bringing the war to an end, and they signed that armistice or ceasefire in November of 1918. And following this, a National Assembly was elected, a little bit like a parliament in Germany. This parliament was led by the Social Democrats, and they met in the town of Weimar to draw up a new constitution for the country, and they did this in July of 1919. So Germany became a democracy with a new constitution. And the key point to remember here is that the constitution was very democratic, but it had some serious flaws. Let's take a look at it. First of all members of the public, that is men and women aged 21 or over, were now able to elect their political leaders, and they had two different opportunities to vote. First of all, they elected their head of state, which was the president. Now, he was head of the Weimar Republic and the armed forces, and he was elected every 7 years. Members of the public also elected their own parliament, called the Reichstag. Now, they voted for the Reichstag roughly every 4 years, and the Reichstag played a role in passing and rejecting laws. The Weimar government was drawn from the Reichstag and had two main parts to it. First of all, the Chancellor, who was head of the government. His job was to choose all ministers, and they became members of the cabinet. He also proposed laws to the Reichstag. Now, to become Chancellor, you had to be a member of the Reichstag, but you also had to be chosen by the President. And the President had to choose a Chancellor who had the support of half the Reichstag. So let's look at some of the key features of the Weimar Constitution and their strengths and weaknesses. Now, you can remember them with the mnemonic FACE, and we're going to talk about all of them, but not necessarily in that order. So first of all, the Weimar Constitution gave all Germans the same freedoms. In the Bill of Rights, all Germans were given equal rights and freedoms such as the freedom of speech. Now, on the one hand, this was very fair and very democratic, but it also gave extremist groups the freedom to express their extreme views and to oppose democracy. The Weimar Constitution introduced an electoral system called proportional representation, and that system gave each party a share of seats in the Reichstag according to their share of votes. Now, on the one hand, that meant that all parties had a fair chance to win seats. But on the other hand, it also meant that extremists could win seats in the Reichstag, and it also meant that no party could win a majority of seats. So that meant that moderate parties had to work together in unstable coalitions. The Chancellor was the leader of the government, and to become Chancellor, he had to have the support of a majority in the Reichstag. That means he had to have the support of over half the Reichstag members. Now, on the one hand, this stopped the Chancellor from becoming too powerful, but on the other, it meant that Chancellors often struggled to pass their laws, and that made the whole system look very slow and ineffective to the German public. Finally, Article 48 gave the President emergency powers. It meant that in the event of an emergency, the President could suspend democracy and rule by decree. That means pass laws without the permission of the Reichstag. Now, on the one hand, this allowed swift action to be taken during a crisis, but on the other, it made democracy look like a failure every time it had to be used. For example, Chancellor Brüning had to ask President Hindenburg to use it 66 times in 1932 to deal with the Great Depression, and every time it was used, it reinforced the idea that democracy was no good at dealing with a crisis. Now's your chance to check your knowledge of the Weimar Constitution. Pause now and match up these features, explanations, and strengths and weaknesses. And here are the answers. Another major political problem for the Weimar Republic was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919. Let's remind ourselves how the treaty came about. First of all, Germany signed an armistice with the Allies on 11th of November 1918. It's important to remember that when the armistice was signed, the German army was not actually yet beaten, but Germany was facing political and economic collapse from within. So the moderate politicians, led by the Social Democrats, had little choice but to sign a surrender. And it was Matthias Erzberger of the Social Democrats who signed that armistice. The next step was to negotiate a peace treaty. Now, Germans had high expectations for this peace treaty, first of all because they had set up a new democracy and the Kaiser was gone. So they expected the Western Allies to support their new democracy by giving them a very fair peace. They also expected the peace talks to be a negotiation, a two-way discussion in which Germany would also have a say. The reality was rather different. The peace talks were held at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris in France. There was no negotiation. Germany was banned from the discussions altogether. And the peace treaty itself was what Germans called a diktat. They had no input into it. It was dictated to them. The big three, Wilson of America, Lloyd George of Britain, and Clemenceau of France wrote the treaty terms. The treaty blamed Germany for the war, and that allowed the imposition of harsh punishments on Germany. The German representatives were brought to the Palace of Versailles and made to sign the treaty in the Great Hall of Mirrors on the final day of talks. So let's look a little closer at the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. You can remember this with the mnemonic LAM, and we're going to talk about all of them, but not necessarily in that order. First of all, blame. The treaty blamed Germany for the war. This was written in Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. And this was possibly the most important part of the treaty, as it was deeply humiliating for Germany. And by blaming Germans for the war, this allowed punishments to be given. Secondly, money. The treaty gave Germany a heavy reparations bill of £6,600 million. This was for the damage caused during World War I, and it was mostly given to France. Thirdly, Germany lost a proportion of its land, 15%, and this included 6 million of its people. This weakened Germany's economy substantially and made it very difficult for Germany to afford its reparations bill. Now, here are some examples of land which Germany lost. Notice, Germany lost some really important industrial land, such as the coalfields in Silesia, and Germany also lost some important agricultural land, such as West Prussia. Note also that Germany lost its overseas colonies, which were given to Britain and France. Finally, the treaty also limited Germany's armed forces. This was deeply humiliating for Germany and left Germany vulnerable to invasion. Here are some examples of that. Germany's army was limited to 100,000 soldiers. The navy was limited to only 15,000 sailors, 6 battleships, and no submarines. Germany was banned from having any air force at all, and the western part of Germany, the Rhineland, was demilitarized. Germany was not able to place any of its soldiers or armed forces there. Here's your opportunity to check your knowledge of the Treaty of Versailles. Pause the video now and write down your answers. I'm going to show you the correct answers in a moment. And here are the correct answers. How many did you score? Now, following on from the armistice and the Treaty of Versailles comes another political problem for the Weimar Republic, the stab in the back myth. But where did the myth come from? Well, firstly, the Kaiser did not tell the German public that the army was in retreat by 1918. Many Germans still believed that the army was winning the war. The war ended when there was a political collapse in Germany, which forced the Social Democrats to sign the armistice. At this point, Germany had not been defeated militarily on the battlefield. And both the armistice and the Treaty of Versailles were deeply humiliating and difficult for Germans to accept. Now, when you add all these three things together, they give rise to a myth known as the stab in the back myth. This was a myth that the German army had been betrayed by the November criminals, the Weimar politicians who signed that armistice in November of 1918. The myth was encouraged by army leaders and also by extremist parties, and the myth really matters because extremist groups used it to gain support and to stir up hatred against the Weimar Republic and the moderate Weimar politicians, such as the Social Democrats. It's worth knowing that in German, the stab in the back myth is known as the Dolchstoßlegende. Another problem for the Weimar Republic was political extremism, and the key point here is that the Weimar Republic was challenged by both left and right-wing extremists, both inside and outside the Reichstag. Let's remind ourselves where the different political parties sit. So in the centre here, we've got our moderate parties. These are the ones who supported democracy and liked the Weimar Republic, such as the Social Democrats, the Centre Party, and the People's Party. You'll notice I'm putting some initials for the parties here, and it's worth knowing those too. Left-wing extremists hated democracy, and they wanted Germany to be controlled by the ordinary people. They opposed capitalism, and they wanted to put wealth, property and business in the hands of the workers. Here are two good examples, the Communist Party and the Spartacist League. There were also right-wing extremists too. They hated democracy as well. They wanted a strong government and army. They supported capitalism, and they wanted to protect the wealth and property and business of the rich. Two good examples of these are the German National Party and the Nazi Party, or NSDAP. Now, these extremists challenged the Weimar Republic from both inside and outside the Reichstag. Let's look firstly at inside the Reichstag. Inside the Reichstag, the three main moderate parties, the Social Democrats, the Centre Party and the People's Party, had only 45% of the seats most of the time, and they struggled to form a majority coalition. Meanwhile, the extremist parties had about 20% of the seats, and they used the Reichstag as a forum in which to attack democracy, airing their criticisms of how weak the Weimar Constitution was and attacking the moderate parties. But the extremist groups also acted outside the Reichstag too. For a start, they carried out assassinations, and there were over 370 assassinations in this time period between 1919 and 1923. It was mostly moderate and left-wing politicians who were killed by right-wing extremists. The extremist groups also carried out uprisings. Now, both left-wing and right-wing extreme groups attempted this, most notably the Spartacists and the Freikorps. Let's look a little closer at those uprisings by extremist groups. First of all, the Spartacist Uprising in 1919. This was carried out by the Spartacists, a left-wing extreme group led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Now, they wanted a communist revolution similar to the one which had happened in Russia in 1917. They seized control of the government newspaper and telegraph offices in Berlin, and they tried to start a workers' uprising. This failed. Firstly, because the leadership and planning behind the uprising was poor. But secondly, because the Weimar government called on the help of the Freikorps to crush the uprising. Luxemburg and Liebknecht, the leaders, were murdered, and the uprising came to an end. Now let's turn to the Kapp Putsch in 1920. This was carried out by the Freikorps themselves. Now, they were ex-World War I soldiers who were right-wing, fiercely anti-communist, and they were led by Wolfgang Kapp. They hated the Versailles Treaty, which they associated with the Weimar Republic. They were angry also at being disbanded or closed by the Weimar government, led by Ebert. So 5,000 of them marched to Berlin with their weapons and seized control of the city. The army of the Weimar government refused to fire on them because they were ex-soldiers. But this also failed. How? Firstly, the Weimar government asked workers to go on strike, which they did. The strike made it impossible for Kapp to rule the country. So the uprising failed, and Kapp fled Germany. Now's your chance to check your knowledge of these extremist uprisings. Pause now, read the statements, and tick whether you think they are relating to the Spartacist Uprising or the Kapp Putsch. And here are the answers. How many did you get right? Now, here are some really useful mnemonics to help you remember the early Weimar problems. The problems themselves you can remember with the mnemonic vest. The details of the Versailles Treaty you can remember with lamb. And the Constitution you can remember with face. Now let's zoom in on the year 1923, which was a year of crisis for the Weimar Republic. And let's see how the crisis developed. The roots of the crisis go all the way back to the Treaty of Versailles, which blamed Germany for the war and punished Germany both economically and militarily. This meant that Germany's armed forces were too weak to prevent invasion, and it also meant that Germany fell behind on its huge reparations bill. When Germany fell behind, the French and Belgians invaded Germany and occupied part of Germany, the Ruhr, one of Germany's most important industrial areas, in order to take materials, goods and machinery as reparations. When this happened, Germans in the Ruhr passively resisted. They went on strike and refused to work for the French. This also meant that Germany was losing all the wealth created by the Ruhr, and the economy was badly disrupted. The government fell increasingly into debt, and to cover that debt, the Weimar government printed more banknotes. This caused hyperinflation. The value of money decreased very rapidly, banknotes became worthless, and the price of goods increased very rapidly. Now, the crisis of hyperinflation caused great suffering to many Germans, but not all Germans. Some actually profited from it. Pause the video now and read this evidence, and try categorizing it into people who suffered during the hyperinflation and people who actually benefited from it. And here are the answers. Note that it was probably the middle class in German society who suffered worst. They lost their savings, their investments, and their insurance policies. It affected them much worse than it affected the rich. So as we come to the end of this tutorial, let's summarise the situation by December 1923, when this man, Gustav Stresemann, takes over as Chancellor. By this point, the Weimar Republic was seen as weak. Unstable coalition governments found it difficult to solve Germany's problems. And the Weimar Republic was very nearly overthrown by extremist groups. Secondly, the Weimar Republic lacked support in German society. Many Germans disliked the Weimar Republic, and middle classes, who would traditionally be supporters of democracy, had suffered particularly badly during the hyperinflation. They blamed the Weimar Republic for their problems. Finally, extremist parties were growing in strength. They were enemies of democracy, and they used Versailles Treaty, stab-in-the-back myth, Ruhr occupation, and the hyperinflation to gain support and stir anger against the moderate parties. Now, you can find out all about how Stresemann dealt with these problems in another tutorial on our channel. Finally, it might be worth getting out your knowledge organisers now and highlighting which parts of the course we've revised during this tutorial. And here's a good idea. Why don't you give your knowledge organiser to somebody and ask them to test you on the bits we've covered. Thanks for watching the tutorial, and remember, there are tons more revision tutorials and exam technique presentations on the YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe.